What happened when America's most favorite game show host walked right into the most explosive arena on daytime TV, knowing nothing about what kind of ambush he was walking into? What began as a simple interview with a celebrity turned into a pure verbal battle zone, an event so jaw-dropping it sent producers into a frenzy, made the audience silent, and caused one legendary comedian to storm off set. It was nothing short of one of the biggest meltdowns in modern TV history, and its aftermath is still reverberating throughout Hollywood. But to see what made a simple friendly visit so incredibly hostile, we have to backtrack to just moments before this event. Steve Harvey was on an absolute rampage of good fortune, walking into ABC studios in New York to do what he does best: make the audience laugh, charm everybody, and promote his new book on relationships. Backstage, he was the happy-go-lucky Steve we all know and love, cracking jokes with the crew and bringing a warm presence everywhere he went. The producers had already stressed to the panel to keep the segment funny, friendly, and light, as the aim was just to plug Steve's new book. The panel expected a breezy talk show interview, but there was one panelist who, unknown to all of them, walked into the studio that day with a totally different motive. The break felt like just another routine transition as Steve took his seat on the couch, adjusting his crisp, clean suit and cracking a grin to the audience. Whoopi Goldberg began introducing him, warm and gracious, welcoming Steve's reign on the family entertainment world as the show was still playing back a clip of his show. Steve walked onto stage to wild applause. He was feeling great as he greeted all the hosts in front of him with one-by-one embraces. As he headed to the final chair in the lineup, the room turned chilly. People at the crowd may not have been aware of the fact that the pleasant vibes ended the moment Steve shook Joy's hand and sparked the cascade of awful television that no one on the crew knew how to handle. But even in that quick greeting, a ripple of tension ran through the atmosphere. A moment of sudden icy stiffness seemed to enter Joy's body, though Steve, a consummate professional, dismissed it as live television anxiety and carried on. Once the panel was situated, Whoopi Goldberg jumped right in with a glowing rundown of all the awards and honors he'd collected, from the monster game show success to the new book to the stand-up special. She asked him how on earth he managed to keep up with a sprawling empire of a career, and Steve, relaxed and effortless with the same kind of debonair presence that's guided his life's work, leaned back, explaining that while he was blessed, work was fun if you loved the hustle. For the first few minutes, the episode was an absolute masterclass in morning show segments, a barrage of hilarious secrets from behind-the-scenes stories and roars of audience laughter. But just when the producers started to let out a collective breath of relief, the whole show derailed entirely. Out of nowhere, Joy Behar broke through with an ice-sharp remark that completely took over the segment. Staring straight into Steve's eyes, she demanded to know how on earth he could stand there and give out relationship advice to millions of people when he'd been married 3 times to 2 different women, outright calling him a hypocrite on live television. The abrupt attack left an instantaneous, palpable shockwave hanging over the room, the joyful atmosphere dissolving into an unbearable dead silence as the studio audience stared on dumbfounded. Steve's practiced smile flickered for just a split second, his mind shifting from promotional pundit to survival mode, and the friendly segment was irrevocably transformed into an unmitigated disaster. Refusing to reveal his hand, Steve returned Joy's steely glare, his voice quiet but deadly. His history of failure didn't make him unfit for the job, he explained. His experience navigating those brutal mistakes and learning through pain had given him a genuine insight into the complex workings of love, one that flawless perfection never could have. In essence, he was an expert through experience, not a perfectionist through circumstance. But Joy could already smell blood, and she wouldn't let him off the hook, ridiculing him relentlessly for his rocky past, and publicly questioning how he could make money off advice given how unreliable he'd proven himself to be. The other hosts huddled on the panel, their faces a picture of sheer terror at the potential of a total studio meltdown, while Steve's jaw visibly clenched tight, the studio audience feeling the intense pressure of a single disastrous broadcast. Steve didn't flinch. Leaning in, Steve stared straight into Joy's eyes and fired back that the whole reason why his perspective is legit is because he lays every single step of his process bare. He's not some professor on a white horse dictating from an ivory tower. He is a man who has lived and died by love. Highs, lows, he had done it all, and used the wounds that he accumulated as the guidebook to help others keep from experiencing the same fate. But Joy saw blood and she just wouldn't let up asking so. Now that's a cautionary tale rather than a guidance counselor. Wouldn't anyone who wants advice on how to find love hire someone who did it correctly the first time, rather than someone who just continued guessing until something stuck? A tense and uncomfortable stillness settled over the audience of the studio. This was not the upbeat, cheerful comedy segment that they had in store, but they were witnessing beloved celebrity icon be stripped bare and fight for his life against what seemed to be devolving into a malicious character assassination. The aura surrounding Steve transformed, and his voice dropped to an unnervingly even tone, as he declared that it was that kind of cynicism that killed relationships And that Joy was turning his very vulnerability into her weapon for the purpose of earning a cheap laugh at his expense, calling it simply malicious, not journalistic. A noxious feeling pervaded the atmosphere, and Joy's face radiated with pride that she was finally able to bring Steve down a peg. She showed no remorse. She laughed a cold, humorless laugh and continued to ram her point home, arguing that she was simply looking out for the people, and that if he was going to brand himself a relationship expert who was profiting off of self-help books, guiding people to find the one, his qualifications and credentials were fair game. What she did next, however, set the daytime legend spiraling. Whoopi scrambled to throw a life raft into the sinking show, desperately yanking the subject matter away from the abyss of impending disaster by mentioning Steve's massive comedy tour. However, Joy brazenly cut off her own moderator, asserting that the public had every right to know whether they were being sold a pack of snake oil by a man who couldn't even manage to properly run his own home. Under the table, Steve's hands clenched into two fistfuls, knuckles going deathly white in a desperate attempt to control the growing furor. He turned a chillingly low, dangerously modulated voice towards Joy, firing back at her with a sharp question about how many failed romantic encounters she had stored away in her own closet, and noting that if past relationships are the key to judgment, the whole panel should be searched. Joy snapped back, clearly annoyed at the fact that her own weapon was being turned against her, stating that she wasn't trying to cash in on millions of lonely people, and that what was happening wasn't a personal issue for her. Steve once again shot back with an incredibly loud and aggressive question over the broadcast system regarding why she felt she had the right to verbally assassinate him in front of millions of people, citing that there was no reason to do so at all besides the fact that she simply felt like doing it. This is where the production crew and control room went into full-blown panic mode. The other co-hosts signaled off-camera frantically to the producers, pleading with them to pull up a commercial to prevent the situation from further deteriorating, while the live audience in the stands grew increasingly hostile towards Joy's bullying behavior. Yet even with the entire production staff trying to help Steve regain control of the situation, Joy leaned over the table like a starving hawk ready to pounce on its prey, saying that she was the only one performing a bit of real journalism while everyone else was happy to throw a few softball questions at Steve. Steve began to laugh, a raw, unbelievable sound in the middle of live broadcast, noting that her journalism wasn't very journalistic, and that she was merely taking out her own bitterness and insecurities on a harmless guest. The mention of the word bitter exploded like a live grenade across the studio audience and on set. Joy's face turned bright crimson as an unbearable silence overcame the set until, with a dangerous whisper, she asked if he had actually called her bitter. What most people don't know is that instead of withdrawing, that's when Steve decided to go all in with his entire hand of chips. She had finally lost it, screaming at the top of her lungs in the studio, for all the world to hear, finally abandoning her guise. "I am disgusted by you men exploiting women's insecurities for financial gain while your personal lives are falling apart in a heap," she yelled, then went on to brutalize his books as manipulative rubbish, which turn women into a simple formula of catching a husband. At this, Steve bolted upright, his voice rising instantaneously to match her decibels. "You don't misrepresent my life's work," he roared back. "I spend my life making families laugh and hope with true advice and guidance. You? What are you doing with your life, sitting in that chair tearing people down?" The studio dissolved into utter bedlam. Half of it roared for Steve whilst the other half jeered and booed at Joy with all their might as live television broadcast went into absolute freefall. Off-camera, the producers frantically waved their hands in an attempt to convince the panelists to stop and put an end to the segment immediately. But rage, pure and unadulterated, had consumed Joy. Her whole body shook as she stood up and spat that her contribution was exposing people who had successfully climbed over vulnerable people's weaknesses for financial gain. "You're nothing but a snake oil salesman in a three-piece suit," she screamed at him as Steve towered over her, and yelled right back, "You're a bitter woman who can't stand seeing anyone else succeed." The ambush was clearly a clear sign of her insecurity and failure to recognize her own problems. Joy screeched at the diagnosis, insulted that he'd psychoanalyze her on her own show, when he then responded with a low, menacing laugh and stated that The View, not the Joy Behar Show, was the name on the building, and with the latter being the problem. Her ego had inflated her sense of importance, that it was at the heart of everything. Whoopi Goldberg bravely threw herself into the fray, pleading for calm, but it was no use. Joy had already begun targeting Steve with a fatal blow. "If you want to talk about your personal life," she stated sneeringly, "tell us what you actually say and do behind the cameras to your employees." Her intent to expose his unprofessional behavior was clear as daylight now that the recording lights had switched off. A deathly terrifying silence filled the room as all discussion ceased, as Joy hadn't just crossed a line but obliterated every rule there was about live broadcasting by bringing backstage whispers out in the open. Steve instantly turned ashen, and then his face morphed into a dangerously dark crimson. Trembling with pure rage, he demanded she repeat what she had just said, but Joy, without flinching, responded, "The audience would love to know the real Steve Harvey, without that stupid mask he wears." However, what happened next made the TV executives tremble more than any of them had ever done in their entire lives, and ensured the future of the show remained uncertain. Steve's reply was in the form of a terrifying rumble of controlled rage. He stepped in close to her and assured her that she was playing with fire and had best be damn careful with the outrageous and untrue accusations she was spouting around the place. He then stated very clearly that if she wanted to criticize his books or his various failed marriages, she could, but when she dragged fabricated libelous accusations into the spotlight, then it moved from investigative reporting and squarely into the realm of character assassination. Her eyes, however, still burned with absolute defiance and contempt, and she scoffed loudly at the phrase character assassination, and stated with sarcasm that she didn't think she could take a lecture about honesty and ethics from the man whose entire career she felt was merely a carefully manufactured illusion of good moral values. Steve boomed through the rafters that he had never in his life ever tried to present himself as an angel, and had always proudly displayed his flaws for all to see, so the personal attack from Joy she then unleashed was totally out of control. He shouted out to a global audience that this cruel personal vendetta she was carrying out under the guise of televised journalism was exactly what was wrong with the media today, and that she cared about destroying individuals rather than informing an audience. And everyone else at the panel had entirely given up trying to keep the segment on track and sat in horrified silence as two masters of their profession tore each other to pieces live on air. The audience were totally divided, with some cheering for Steve and his defenses and others for Joy's brutal attack, but each one completely riveted to the spectacle of the century. Joy burst out with an icy sardonic laugh and assured him that she didn't even know him well enough to bear any personal resentment towards him, and stood proudly by her claims to be professionally obligated to ask the sort of difficult questions that everyone else at the panel had been too afraid to address. He responded with utter disbelief, his voice cracking. He said it wasn't a single professional thing that this attack was, and asked what in God's name he had ever done to deserve such an extreme reaction. For a second, Joy's expression changed. A flash of pure fear and confusion was in her eyes, and a split-second crack in her composure that she swiftly disguised under a wave of increased vitriol, as she then informed him that the problem wasn't with him specifically, but what he represented, that idea that simply by virtue of being famous, that they were suddenly well-informed on the topic of human behavior. But he wasn't missing a step in his fight against her. He fired back instantly, with how she on the other hand represented a much darker form of sickness, one that had convinced itself that making everyone miserable and being inherently destructive is some kind of genius. The tension in the studio got so heavy, it was as if the room was going to completely run out of air. Every single camera just kept rolling on what became the most historic real breakdown of networking politeness. Nobody working that day knew how to stop. The production assistants looked like statues standing in the wings, completely shocked out of their wits to move, but scared to interrupt live TV. Joy instantly got up, her voice now at a piercing squeal, and yelled that now everyone could finally see past his pretty down-home mask. She explained that every last shred of his charming small-town wisdom disappeared as soon as he was pressed. She stood pointing her finger and yelled that Steve Harvey really wasn't more than just an angry man picking on a woman on network television. Steve, stunned that she could have the nerve, snapped, "Are you seriously trying to pull the victim card after this hour of basically just trying to slander me, my integrity, and the whole damn thing that I've worked for in my life?" Joy snapped, "Well, maybe that's because it is incredibly rich for a man whose money is based on teaching men how to respect women to be standing up and screaming at me right now." Steve totally silenced her with his booming voice that bounced off the rafters as he bellowed, "I'm not yelling at a woman, I'm yelling at a disrespectful, unprofessional person. The color of you has absolutely nothing to do with this toxic trash you've spewed." Whoopi desperately tried to interject in a quivering voice, begging them to both just take a step back. But Steve was completely finished with the niceties of network TV. He completely ignored Joy and turned to the audience. In his calm and angry voice, he told them, "I came up here to try and give you laughs and hope, and to give you a real and honest peek into my life. But instead, what you've gotten for the last 20 minutes is a carefully planned setup." Joy shouted, "But I am just doing the job of a real journalist." But Steve quickly turned back to her and dropped his voice to a dangerous, icy tone, saying, "Well, you did actually give us a revealing look into who the hell you are, as you destroyed your colleagues on your set. I can't say that I don't feel bad for those girls who have to deal with this every single day." This statement made Joy turn a bright, furious shade of blood red, and she was speechless for the first time all morning. When she finally managed to choke out a response, she stood trembling and screaming, "How dare he even insult me and those women?" Steve never even flinched. He calmly said he wasn't insulting them, he was showing sympathy towards them, and he further said that there was nothing more he needed to do to explain her personality for the last 20 minutes. A dark, ominous silence fell across the studio again as Joy finally seemed to collapse in the face of his harsh truth, and then with one final word, the situation got irreversibly ugly as the conversation got really interesting. All segment long, Joy had continued to push and push, hoping to elicit some unhinged, ugly breakdown from Steve that she could broadcast to the world on live television. Now that he was finally at her limit, however, and she could actually see what she'd unleashed, she was utterly stunned, paralyzed by the sheer force of the monster that she'd brought out in him. After a final glance around the shattered room of the uncomfortable panel of the baying audience, Steve looked directly back at Joy. "I'm done with this," he said quietly, the clear statement that this nasty ambush was not what he'd signed up for, nor the kind of program that viewers needed at home. Then, with the killer final remark, Steve reached down and began to aggressively yank off his microphone. The ripple effect that this alone caused within the entire network was a shockwave. Guests simply did not walk off the view. That's how sacred this ritual was in the universe of daytime television. Joy, realizing with the panic that the impending disaster brought upon her, that she had catastrophically overplayed her hand, started pleading with him to wait. But Steve put his hand up and cut her off. He could not afford to sit there and not respect himself, if the show was unwilling to give him that respect. He offered a flat "happy holidays everybody," and refused to play any further games. The moment Steve stood up and began his walk towards the door, utter bedlam ensued in the studio. Half the room jumped to their feet chanting and applauding as he walked, and half the room booed him with intense vitriol. Standing on the very precipice of the stage, however, the comedy legend stopped one last time, and looking directly into the camera one final enduring time, had one last word for all of us at home. He reminded us that life is just too damn short to be wasted pulling each other down when we could spend our lives trying to build each other up. And then Steve walked out of the room, leaving behind the most infamous explosive meltdown ever seen on daytime television. Joy Behar, meanwhile, sat stunned and motionless in her chair. Well, that was something.